All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're honored today to have Misha Sra join us today from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she leads the Human AI Integration Lab. Previously, she received her PhD from the MIT Media Lab, and she has been working on very interesting topics that might relate to CHM's current work. For instance, one of the topics that she's interested in is in learning how experiential AI interfaces will look like once equal bits have faces, which reminds me a little bit of the face game. Also, there is another question that she's interested in, which is how can AI learn from human behavior? Which reminds me also of the cultural transmission chains that are investigated in our group. Two concepts that I came across while researching some of your work. One of them was mentioned at a talk at Stanford. The concept is perceptual engineering, about how to manipulate the user's perception to guide an interactive experience. I found that to be pretty interesting. Another one that I came across was augmented orality, which was about how to augment an experience, specifically a gameplay experience with sound. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Misha. Just the last note, she would like to answer questions during your talk. Right?
Yeah, the more interactive, the better. It will be great. Then I don't have to do all the talking. But thank you for the introduction. And I'm a little bit surprised you did a bit of digging around and looked at perceptual engineering. That was the name of my lab when I just started at UC Santa Barbara, which was 2019 fall. And then I switched more to human AI integration because unfortunately, everybody assumed that perceptual engineering meant I had a neuroscience lab, which I don't, right? More computer science. And so perceptions affected the perception of my lab name and I had to change it out. Right, so today I'm mostly going to talk a little bit about what my lab is currently focusing on. Maybe run through the bigger vision of what my lab is about and then talk about projects and then depending on time, sort of just depending on, we go more into detail or less or do field projects, etc. Just sort of not be hopefully super formal about this. All right. So yeah, very excited to actually be here. My first time in Berlin and actually first time giving a talk at any place in Germany. So this is kind of exciting. And I really like Berlin. And I came here from Frankfurt, which I didn't like. So big difference there. All right. So even before I get into anything, I guess the first thing I'd like to talk a little bit about, and this might look familiar, is this idea that human augmentation fundamentally started 3.3 million years ago when we started building tools, right? It's about as old as that. And then over time, we've continued to build tools. We still build tools. Only the materials that we use to build tools have evolved. We did stones and we did bronze, iron, and now our tools are digital. And of course, we know the fundamental motivation to build tools is to solve the problems that we're facing. That's what humans do, right? It's the primary motive to build tools. But then not only do tools allow us to solve problems, they actually allow us to think about the problems in more depth, maybe more nuanced manner, so we can figure out better and more different tools to solve the related problems, right? Tools also allow us to communicate knowledge and skills related to tool building. And, all of this knowledge we can imagine get communicated, disseminated within a community. And at some point, that knowledge then gets embedded in culture. And over time, that culture becomes tradition. And this could be a fairly long period of time or a short period of time, depending on what is it that we're talking about. Right? And as I just mentioned, that building a tool allows us to build newer and better tools. We might have built the first hammer at some point millennia ago, and then now we have so many different types of hammers. We got the ball peen hammers, the bigger hammers, sledgehammers. They're all customized to the task of hitting something, but for different purposes, right? Again, tools help us look at the problem and identify its limitations because they now give us a way to explore the problem in different ways. And then the whole cycle of building newer tools sort of continues from there. And then lastly, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? At the base of the pyramid is our physiological safety, shelter, fundamental needs. And the same tool can help us solve those problems, right? A hammer can help us build shelter. And over time, once those needs are met as we go higher up in the hierarchy, then the same tool actually helps us with self-expression. So at the top, the same hammer now can help us carve out the statue of David. The same tool evolves based on our own needs at the moment. So obviously all of this sort of relates to the practicality of how we have augmented our abilities with tools. But the desire for almost unachievable forms of augmentation is rampant in all our media and culture and stories, all the way from, let's say, Epic of Gilgamesh, which we have the oldest record is about 2100 BCE, and talks about immortality, which we can think of almost as an extreme form of augmentation, right? Then we got mythology where, as an example, Apollo wanted to hit targets with 100% accuracy, which in general is not humanly possible, but it's a desirable augmentation. You got Black Panther, so comics show that, speed and agility, physically not possible, but desirable goals. And then the last example, I thought maybe for anyone who's a science fiction fan here might recognize this as altered carbon, right? You discard your physical body as a sleeve, you keep your brain intact, and then just pick up another sleeve and go on. And you can think of that as a form of augmentation to yourself. So all of these, right, almost impossible abilities, they kind of reflect our aspirations, our desires. And the development of tools reflects the reality of what we can do to try to accomplish these in some way or form. And then moving on to more recent era, right? Industrial evolution and digital revolution, where in the 18th, 19th centuries, humans discovered ways to augment our abilities in terms of our manufacturing capacity, in terms of our ability to just do more, right? And I'm not even saying it was good or bad. I'm not passing any judgment here, but mostly this is what happened. That, assembly lines, steam engines made distances shorter, we could travel faster, further, and then assembly lines made production and elements or objects accessible to a much larger populace. And then with the invention of the computer, right, humans found a new way to augment productivity. We can argue about that, right? Does it make us more productive or not? But that was the intention and the goal. And so building now on the foundation of the digital revolution, AI, in my opinion, sort of represents sort of this new potential for human augmentation. And specifically, I'm interested in human skill augmentation. And as AI continues to advance, we can imagine there'll be many new ways of it to augment our physical, mental, and all kinds of social capabilities. Right, and we all went through this in November 22 when ChatGPT came out, right? Everybody sort of had a little bit of an existential crisis at CS. Worldwide, everybody responded to with fear and of course with positivity, had a mix of both, that we've done it, AI is here and it's going to replace us, right? And yes, it is going to take its toll. Things have already started. But I am a little bit more optimistic about it. And I think of AI as yet another tool in our arsenal of tools as a way to actually augment our own skills and abilities. So as examples, I'm looking at fitness training, a physical skill that usually requires a coach or an instructor, and we can imagine an AI agent serving that role. We can build simulations for things that are really hard to study at maybe a large population scale and use systems to do that. We can think of skills such as conflict resolution, where we can practice engaging with now an intelligent agent in a safe environment to help us learn those things. And again, physical therapy, some of the areas that I'm personally interested in. And I think all of this is now possible because, or can only be possible if we have interactive AI. if things are real time, if systems are responsive, right? In the way ChatGPT responds to you. Even that I kind of find slow because you go line by line at a time, but there's other companies that are speeding it up. Now you get a response like that. But the fundamental point being, it needs to be interactive in real time and not sort of later or asynchronous for us to be able to do some of the things I'm talking about. Right, so I'm gonna just put it all up. In terms of what my lab and I care about is fundamentally AI and XR being augmented virtual and mixed reality. So just summed up together as XR, particularly for skill augmentation. And skills, sort of these four verticals fall into that, where we want to learn new skills. It could be something like surgery, so in terms of medical education system, or I want to become a better basketball player. I want to practice that. In terms of recovering skills, we can imagine that if you break a leg in a skiing accident, you have to go to physical rehab to actually relearn how to walk and train your body to do this again. Now we can imagine AI agents actually assisting clinical therapists in those domains. In terms of enhancing skills that we already have, we can all communicate, and everybody does it to a different extent, to different ability. How can we use new kinds of tools to help augment that ability? Specifically when it comes to things like conflict management. Not everybody is able to talk to their manager, their boss, their partner when the situation is stressful, right? And maybe in my scenario, right now I'm dealing with a lot of students who did not participate in the class project, but they all want A's in their class project. How do I deal with this human to human challenge? And then of course, interpersonal communication. And then lastly, empowering individuals who have maybe not the ability to do certain things, that now we can use AI to help them do the things that a lot of people take for granted, right? Something as simple as playing a video game. So these are sort of, in the context of augmentation, these are sort of the areas I'm going to focus on in my work. And we think of societal impact, right? That's kind of what we want to do, is get everything once tested in a lab, out of the lab and out in the hands of real people to estimate what is the real world impact of that technology, that it doesn't just die once you publish a paper, in the sense like nothing really happens. And so for all the things I'm talking about, right, the potential for impact, in my opinion, is massive. There's 1 billion people worldwide, and if that visual represents a billion, that live with disabilities. They don't have the services, the tools, the technology to actually be able to do the things that they need to do. Obviously, people figure out workarounds, right? But there's no reason why technology has not made its way to there, to these people. And this is both physical and cognitive disabilities, mental health concerns, not just like, you need a wheelchair or something. More than half the people over the age of 60 in the US have a disability. And I'm defining disability almost as a spectrum. And I kind of don't think of it as a discrete thing where, one morning you wake up with a backache and suddenly you can't do half the things you could do yesterday. And that's sort of a temporary disability. And on the other side is, let's say you have a neuromuscular disease and you've never been able to stand up or walk or do any of those things. And in this entire continuum, throughout life, we kind of go back and forth, right? You get injured and you're temporarily disabled. Like you now broke your leg, you have to be in a wheelchair or use crutches, and then you get fixed, and then you're back there. And then maybe at some point, let's say people got COVID or people got long COVID, they have other issues now. So they are transitioning, moving along the spectrum. We're actually expecting by 2034 that people in the US, older adults, will outnumber kids for the first time in US history. And generally, we know that the world, especially the Western world, is aging, right? And we're really not building technologies for that group. We're building technologies. Fundamentally, you look at companies for the 18 to maybe 40, 44 group, the age range that they think is going to use tech, whatever their perception is. Right. So you're talking about injuries, about 100 million people in the US alone. That's like a third of the population. We're talking about adults get a musculoskeletal injury every year that requires some form of rehab. I mean, I'm assuming everyone's familiar with the US healthcare system, right? It is a problem in itself, but they may or may not have access to rehab that they might need, right? And then there's a lot of people living with, 1 million people at least living with Parkinson's, and probably many more with Alzheimer's and other diseases that then come on with aging. And world's population is 8 billion, right? I'm only accounting for 1.x billion here. What about the rest of the people? I'm sure everyone out there has wanted to learn a physical skill or the other. And by physical skill, I mean things like you want to learn how to play the guitar or the piano, or you want to learn how to ski or fencing or basketball, like any of these psychomotor skills that we want to learn, right? So in general, I believe the potential for societal impact is tremendous if we start digging into this area of skill-based augmentation. Now, to get to that level of impact, we have so many challenges that need to be overcome. And I'm only looking at a small subset of those challenges, but even within this small subset of the 3 core areas of, let's say, AI and user-related challenges in engineering, this is going to take more than a single researcher's lifetime to even deal with all of this, right? It needs a larger, more collective effort to resolve some of these challenges. For example, for the types of things I'm talking about, let's say physical rehab therapy, right? It's not like I can go online and download a data set and I'm like ready to build a model. The data sets don't exist. And the minute you start talking about health, privacy and HIPAA and all of those data constraints start coming in place. So let's say I have to, but whatever I do, for most things, I need to build my own data set. And for many of these things, to build a data set, sometimes I need to build hardware to be able to even collect the data, right? And then I can build a model and finally have some level. If it's just simple classification, I do that. And then start building applications or systems or tools for users to use. Because that was the original goal. We want to build something user-facing. And at that point, once you have an AI system and you got a human, now you start thinking about questions of explainability, of trust. I mean, as research here is already exploring, the perception of this AI, like people don't want the AI in a manager role because they have some notion of what that means. And they may potentially think of an AI to be okay in a peer or a mentor role or something like that. And then engineering all of this to try to build a system that you can give to somebody, its own challenge in itself, right? It's not even a research challenge at that point, but to build multimodal systems, to take in input from multiple sensors that a user might have, physiological sensing, cameras all over the place, all the types of sensors, all of them work at their own frequencies. All of them now need to be time synchronized for us to actually be able to ingest the information to now build models, right? So interface design challenges go up. Everything we've known about designing UIs from the last 25 years, when Norman and Nielsen first came up with design guidelines, or Schneiderman had 8 golden rules of designing UIs, kind of changes because now the system is no longer deterministic. The backend is stochastic. It's going to make errors. It's not always 100% going to give you the same answer as you want it to. And then what happens, right? How do you build reliability into a system like that? Right, so many, many challenges. What? I'm not sure why I have that 3 times. All right, so sort of switching gears a little bit now, maybe I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of things we are starting to build and look into that feeds into this larger vision of human scale augmentation, all the way from building hardware for data sets to actually exploring AI in different contexts, right? So this work here, we wanted to design a modular headband. And again, the idea, like I said, was to actually be able to collect data. So then we can do classification or any other model we want to build on top of that to be able to use in a real-time system. The context is task performance. Like you imagine a person, here, person is performing a physical task. And when you do a physical task, you move around, you have lots of different types of equipment you're using. You're not just sitting in front of your laptop with the camera looking at your face all the time. So you have occlusions, you have different types of emotions, sometimes you're really focused, you're excited, your next step is coming along as you expected, the context is changing, and the environment is super dynamic. So in this scenario, we can kind of do two things, right? We can put cameras and sensors all over the kitchen space where the person is, or we can build something wearable. But if we start putting sensors everywhere, then for every kind of task, we have to start putting sensors and cameras everywhere, in your garage, in your kitchen, in your office, in the gym, in a therapist's office. So we decided to go the wearable route, where everything is on the person, and then they can do any task, and we have access to data based on that specific task. Right, so our questions here was that how do we model a user's emotional state as they're performing the task? How do we know what they're feeling? And the reason we want to know what they're feeling is so we can figure out how do we give them feedback? What kind of feedback do we give them? How much feedback do we give them? And by we, I mean an AI agent who is now acting as an instructor or a coach or a mentor or whatever else. Yeah, question?
One question. So you're saying how you need to collect a lot of these data sets because they just don't exist. Like, could you, like, what would be the limitation with, say, going to a bunch of YouTube videos or something where people are?
Oh, we do that. That's part of data collection, right? So I'm not saying every type of data we need to do or collect requires building hardware and doing that. This is one side of things. But yeah, we do that. We screen. We can YouTube, we can look at, if we want just text data, obviously we can go online and do that. So it depends on the task we're focusing on. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what OpenAI is doing, right? Is using YouTube data. I mean, they built Whisper AI for that to get YouTube data because there the expectation is the quality of the information is better. Because people put in effort when they're making videos and things like that. So yeah. All right, so the next question was that how can we build a single device that can allow us to do both data collection and then eventually inference in real time when someone is performing a task? And then lastly, how do we build something that others can use? Because currently, some of the related systems I've included here and that, several of them are one-off systems that people build, published a research paper, and that was it. The system or the device wasn't released, and didn't have enough sensors or whatever. It wasn't a multi-purpose setup, right? So like kneecap is just reflective cameras, egocentric body tracking, but not much else, and almost limited. Model I is worn on the body. It's using optical flow, I believe, to do some body tracking. Physio HMD was the first version, so physiological sensors that go on the inside of a VR headset. And that came out of the Media Lab, and it could track a bunch of things. It turned into a product with OpenBCI Galileo, but it's also a $25,000 product, and I can't afford to buy it. So that was another thing. It's also not an open system that we can then hack, extend, and do all those things. It sort of becomes a closed system. Meta has its own glasses, but the glasses have outward-facing cameras, and then they do gaze tracking, so very limited modalities. And then similar with Air Glass, and then we can look at Project Astra coming out of Google. Most likely, it'll have forward-facing cameras, and it'll have a microphone and some speakers. Maybe they'll do gaze tracking. I don't know. So we wanted something that can do a little bit more, because if we want to get a person's emotional state, we need access to a little bit more information, whether it's through cameras, we can see their face, or through electrodes that we can actually do other kinds of EOG, we can do for eyes, and other kinds of sensing to get more information. Right? Yeah.
Hi, Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, you're actually just looking at perceptual input to understand internal, intrapersonal emotional states. Was there any point that you asked the individuals that you were maybe measuring? I mean, I understand if you are using models from anonymous individual computations that you know what they're thinking. But I'm just wondering how good this quote unquote mechanical AI perspective taking theory of mind is actually mapping onto actual emotional states. So are you?
We haven't gotten to that point yet. We haven't even gotten to that point yet. We're still building hardware to collect data.
So you just, if I understand correctly, you're just collecting emotional state based on how individuals.
No. Properties,
not internal, like.
No. Okay, so couple of questions over there, right? What your face show. Okay, let me show you the device and then I'll come back to your question.
Yeah.
Right. So as I said, we want to build something wearable. It has multiple sensors, and what we have is fisheye high frequency cameras, so we can capture your facial expressions. We got pupil cameras that are capturing pupillometry, so we know the dilation of your pupils, how big or small they're going, and of course that gives us gaze also, where you're looking. We got physiological sensing like heart rate, so we can put a sensor here, so we actually have some other information. And the goal is for all of this to be correlated to not only get a sense of arousal, which is fairly straightforward, but also valence. The whole system has a forward-facing camera, so we know what you're looking at, the context of your task, not just inward-facing to the user, right? And then all of this coupled with a HoloLens 2 device, then we can actually show you information in AR based on what's happening. To collect the data set, we use a standardized emotion data set like the IAPS, which already has a bunch of videos that have been validated with many, many users over time. So it is actually a standardized data set used in emotion space. And when we have people watch that video, we're tracking everything that they're doing as they're watching those video sequences. Then we ask them to label subjectively what they felt at the time they're watching it. Now we have a correlation between the labels ground truth, whatever the data set includes, plus the user's subjectivity. That we now correlate with what we captured in their pupil, in their gaze, in their facial expression, in their heart rate. Together, all of this, now we can start thinking about building a model to actually come out with an emotion classification. This does not guarantee that eventually when people are doing something, what we see, because the predominant data is facial expressions, right? An observed emotion is not always correlated with felt emotion, right? I might be feeling super stressed out right now, but maybe my face doesn't want to show it because I'm in a social scenario, whatever the reason is, right? And so that correlation is super hard to break down, also even capture unless we get subjective information. Even then, a person may or may not be willing to share, right? They don't want to show that they're scared. Face doesn't show they're scared. Face shows confidence. And they won't tell you they're scared. So you'll never know that. And that's sort of a hard problem. And it's actually a fundamental problem in using facial expressions and emotional estimation, which is part of the reason why we use physiological sensing is that you, maybe barring a few people, it's really hard to control your own heart rate, right? And so physiological data like that, control your pupil size. Those pieces of information maybe can give us a little bit more information about what you're actually feeling versus what you're showing on your face. And that was sort of the reason why we wanted to do something like this that gives us more than just what a camera shows if you sit in front of it. Yep. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, moving on. And can someone please keep me on time and tell me when to stop? All right. I'm kind of going to skip through that because this is just sort of the building of it. The device, this is a very early version of it. You can see cable management is its own nightmare. We use a Jetson, so it's wearable, portable. It's not tethered to any computer or anything like that. Now we're in the process actually of changing the device, the 3D printing version of it also. Oh, the reason these are included is that, as I said earlier, all 3D printed parts are modular and the device fits on any person's head whatever size it is, right? And we use sort of the turning, tightening, loosening notches, kind of like the HoloLens sitter, to make it as best as possible to fit a lot of different sizes. We do have a software pipeline, so we try to, like I said, time synchronizing all this data is necessary for us to be able to use it in a model. And so you can see the images that we're capturing from the facial cameras, both the face and the body, because it's the arm, you can flip, the arms are all flexible, etc. Far right, far left, well, that part of the screen, you can see pupil data, so you can see dilation, right? And we have to establish a baseline for dilation because light, of course, impacts that. The front-facing camera shows the context, so bottom right over there, and then this is all the physiological sensing, the IMU data, the heart rate data, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where we are. We don't have a model yet. We're working on one. Technically, we're still data collecting. We haven't even started looking at it. But fundamentally, as you know, when somebody's performing a task, they're not going to have macro expressions. Nobody's going to have a big smile or big anything. It's going to be micro expressions. There are very, very limited micro expression data sets out there for us to even look at some kind of benchmarking, etc. But what we're going to end up collecting is going to be micro expressions. Very subtle eyebrow movements, maybe a slight movement over here. And that's why the high frequency cameras. So we can actually capture these subtle motions of the face. And then the hope is we can then have some level of classification along with the other data for it to be meaningful enough that our AI agent then can take this as input and then provide the person, or at least decide the timing of when to provide them feedback. How are you doing? Did you make a mistake? Or what happened, etc. Right? Okay, maybe I'll go over one more project, and I have 10 minutes, and then we can stop there. Right, so in this case, so this is my student, and she has spinal muscular atrophy, which is a neuromuscular disease, which means that progressively from birth to whatever age, you lose control over your muscles. It's like paralysis. You just have no control over your muscles, right? So you can see in the bottom right figure that all her research happens like this. This is the only muscle she can control in her whole body, other than her face. And her typing, paper writing, coding, everything. Even this doesn't have the full range of motion. It has limited motion, right? So in this case, we got to having a conversation one day, and we were talking about video games, and we're like, wait, you've never played video games? Or maybe she did when she, as I said, it's a progressive disease, when she was maybe preteen, early teen, that she was able to play somewhat, but now obviously she cannot hold a controller, she cannot do any of this. And so we started thinking about, well, let's try to make that happen. And so this project came about as a way for us to build something that, she can use and play in her daily life. So now, how many? 70% of the US population plays video games daily. 50% of the global population, 4 billion people, play video games every day. Right? It's not just some activity very few people do. This includes all kinds of games, mobile, console, PC, I don't know, anything else. And so video games aren't just, of course, for entertainment. There are many other things that video games can allow us to do, including building community, there's education, there's health and well-being, depending on the type of game you're playing. And of course, escaping reality, right? Adventure, that's sort of what they're for. And unfortunately, a lot of this stuff becomes inaccessible to people who have motor disabilities. You look at consoles now, and they have a lot of accessibility features, right? Games like Last of Us on the PS4. I think 65 accessibility features that captures features for people who have visual impairments, hearing impairments. But the fundamental assumption is you're able to hold a controller. That is your input. On the console, this is your input if you're playing on the keyboard and mouse. And if you cannot do that, you really have no options. I mean, games have evolved tremendously since the 80s. Technology, graphics, all the fidelity, everything you can do, but the input mechanisms are still the same, right? And Microsoft does have a controller where you can plug in different controllers to it, but they're still physical controllers. So we started thinking about, like I said, this was the fundamental motivation of what should we do. And we also didn't want to build a video game specifically that she could play with her thumb like that, like a separate video game for someone who has a motor disability. The idea was for her to play the same games that others are playing around her, right? And so certainly had a lot of constraints, and she's my student, she's the one who built the system, did the user study, etc. We're designing it for her and with her. So we wanted something that's hands-free but not wearable. If you have a neuromuscular disease, fatigue is a huge challenge. And if you put something, even wearing a VR headset or eye gaze tracking system, after a few minutes, it's just very fatiguing for the neck muscles. And she also doesn't have that much range here. So gaze and BCI were out, right? BCI is super slow, a lot buggy. You really can't use it to play a first-person shooter. And gaze is similarly buggy, but also requires you to wear something. She had already tried gaze-based system, didn't want to use it. Of course, we want something that's easy to use, easy to learn, is inexpensive, low fatigue, is customizable, because everyone who has a motor disease is going to have different range and degree of it and different type of it, different manifestation. For a shooter or a car racing game, you need a faster, reliable system. Didn't want anything that's mouth or tongue based. You imagine keeping your mouth open for even 10 minutes trying to play a video game with a mouse-based joystick. Of course, you can learn to do it. It's maybe not the most pleasant experience. We didn't want anything speech-based. I mean, tongue is a muscle, and if you have a neuromuscular disease, your speech may or may not be maybe different from what the models generally are trained on, right? And that becomes challenging and again becomes slow. And then obviously we're looking at inclusion and equity and how do we build something that everybody is doing. So while the design goal is of course generalizability, we're building assistive technology, so we have an N of 1 experiment and setup, right? The process is iterative, participatory, co-design. I mean, we did it all together. Just wanted to share an example of there's a product on the market called the quad stick. I think it's about $500 for the base quad stick, and then you have attachments for the wheelchair, for the bed, for the desk, whatever else you want to use it. It's a mouth-based joystick, and there are players out there that use this to play the games, like Fortnite or any other game. And my student does have it. She's just not a big fan of wanting to keep her mouth open that long. So it's functional, just not maybe pleasant for her. Right. So then after many, many conversations, like I said, we had so many constraints and we had to say no to so many different existing technologies, we decided to build a system that uses facial expressions. Like I said, she has access or she has control over her facial muscles. And so we thought that this would be great for us to be able to recognize facial expressions using the action units on the face and then convert them into key mappings, which then correspond to actions that a video game character takes in the game. So we built sort of 3 different games representative. The first one is more to learn to use the system. It's just fundamentally walking, exploring, learn how to turn, how to bend the character, how to pick up items and things like that. The first-person shooter is what we use in the user study we did. And then car racing was another challenging one because turning the car with a facial expression. I mean, if you start imagining that, when to start, how much to turn, when to stop, and does she have to continuously keep doing the expression on and on and on and on and on, and which direction to turn? All of these suddenly become challenging. We did have a speech input mechanism. We do speech recognition using Google speech to text, but we don't use it for gameplay. We use it more for things like start a game, stop a game, something simpler. where latency doesn't really matter so much. Right, so for those who are not familiar with how facial expression recognition works, currently, the face is codified into these 44 action units. And they've developed over time, coming from the facial action coding system from the 70s, I think Ekman and Friesen, right? And so action units like AU6, they're all labeled, is the cheek raiser, the common name. AU12 is the lip puller. So AU6 plus AU12 gives you the expression of a smile, which we then interpret as a positive emotion. There's many layers of things happening here, right? And that's what we're doing in this case. As I said, that we needed the whole thing to be customizable. It is a progressive disease, and while we don't have extreme levels of customizability here, the idea was that maybe today the person can make a particular expression and tomorrow they're not able to make that expression. So you can keep changing that mapping of expressions. And then this was also needed for a user study because everybody had a different type of muscular control over their faces. Right, so then we built the system. The question was, how well does it work? And then what kinds of things are going to go wrong? So we did a study with 12 participants. All of them had muscular dystrophy or spinal muscular atrophy after piloting with one user in the lab. And then again, this was done during COVID. So doing everything online over Zoom for my student to do this study, hardest study ever done, in my opinion. You know, it was, our participants have different levels of ability to use the computers, to install software, to sit up for an extended period of time, including my student herself, right? So we split it over 2 sessions where we sent them the package, they set it up, install it with help or without help, however their computer setup works. We had challenges like you're communicating over Zoom. If someone can't type and then someone can't talk, how do you do this communication? We had a participant who had a hearing impairment, so you can't talk to them on Zoom. Typing is challenging because access to typing is not possible. And so we had lots of other challenges with individual participants like that, right? There was one who could only lie down and not sit up. So they all have their own unique circumstances as well, right? Which is kind of why I think this is the hardest study that I've seen done. But managed it, 12 volunteers, you know, and all kudos to my student. She did it all, right? She ran the study. So we mostly, from a data perspective, we didn't do excessive amounts of analysis. We sort of looked at, you know, what was the efficiency and satisfaction like? Was it easy to use? Was it comfortable for people? So they're mostly looking at the system's usability more than anything else, and whether sensitivity and learnability, right? And this is after every participant customize it to decide which facial expression they want to map to which character movement, and the degree of that expression. Right, so mostly positive ratings here. Then we also looked at the game itself, right? Was first-person shooter as challenging as they thought it was going to be? The game level of challenge is also modifiable. Like you want zombies to come at you slower, you can do that. So generally positive here. Qualitatively, participants did find it was easy to use, and they were just generally excited that they're able to do something that they couldn't do before, right? And so there's some of that effect for sure going into the results. What I thought was also interesting was that we just downloaded a few games from Steam and our system worked out of the box with these games, which is really great, right? And more game designers can add this keyboard remapping ability, then there's no reason why people with motor disabilities can't play games that are already available out there for them to download. So now that leaves us with some other research questions, open-ended, but I think I'm gonna end with the video. There should be audio in the video. I don't know. I'm just gonna switch. I think I'm on time. I was right on the sorry about that. But maybe I will stop here and not jump into anything else new, and maybe we can do some Q&A.
Yes.